Krista, you find me?
Yes, sir.
Are we in compliance with the Freedom of Information Act?
Yes, sir, we are.
Very much. Can I have the roll call, please?
Yes, sir. Mr. Brown?
Here.
Mr. Harkins?
Here.
Mr. Ames?
Here.
Mrs. Becker?
Here.
Mr. Lennox?
Here.
Mr. Stanford?
Here.
Mayor McCann?
Here.
All present, sir.
Have an approval of the agenda? So moved.
Second.
All in favor, raise your right hand. Thank you very much. Workshop discussion, Mr. Orlando, it's yours, sir.
Thank you.
Could you explain to everybody why you're sitting in that seat?
Yes.
That's all.
Yeah. So I can see the screen. Good morning. Good to be here with you at our workshop. What I have in front of you are the same materials that I overviewed at first reading. And so as we look back at first reading, I explained the overall budget, explained the budget goals, and then really got into the details. For today's purpose, I will go through the same presentation, perhaps at a much quicker pace in some areas, to leave a lot of time or room for Q&A from you, from public comment, if the public so chooses. So with that being said, we know that we took a look at our budget year over year, especially through COVID, and most recently we heard from Moody's late April that the credit quality has withstood, that our credit quality has withstood the temporary turbulence of the coronavirus pandemic. So congrats to us, thank goodness. We're on a great track. We know that we have a healthy tax base and a strong, reliable financial performance of our revenues, and we also carefully spend dollars. We have a growing tax base, a robust financial position, prudent fiscal management, and modest debt and pension burden. We went over these things at first reading. I won't spend too much time on them today. But I really want to make sure that we're clear on what the budget goals are, right? So this year I've said more than ever, I believe, since last year, that the budget is now priority based. So a couple notes on priority based, that we started with available revenues rather than last year's expenditures to set our budget, or at least to set the foundation for our decision making. And that in this budget, we matched available resources with community priorities as approved by you in the strategic plan. So practically a somersault from just budgeting to figure out where your dollars go. So some principles of priority-based budgeting, just I think for discussion or for knowledge, that we prioritize our services more programmatic than department-based, that we provide transparency to the community, and I think we will do that, and I have some thoughts on how to even communicate it a little more focused through the year, so to align the budget updates with the strategic plan updates collectively, and that we focus on the results. And so as we look at our plan, it guides the strategic plan, and the strategic plan influences and is influenced by our operating budget for implementation. We had a July date earmarked to be together for strategic planning, mid-year, I call it, mid-year update. We're going to find another date real soon. That's the same date that we're here, and I'll say it for the public as well. We'll be at the Municipal Association annual meeting. So we'll find a date, either late July, early August, whatever date works for all of our schedules, but it's a time to align what we're budgeting with the strategic planning work that we have. So overall, proposed is $119,501,114 consolidated budget. You will see year over year, so fiscal year 20 actuals versus 21 actual versus 20 original budget versus 23 proposed. So you see percent change year over year, 48 million general fund, a 10.5% increase. The differential there in terms of revenues are the short-term rental fee and more use of state and local A-tax in our budgets as they're accruing at a higher rate this year than last. A 61% change increase in capital projects. Know that a considerable portion of those dollars are from prior year, from this current year, which will be prior year next year, unspent funds in the stormwater or in the capital improvement program. This is a schedule of our revenues, and at this point I'll turn to Mr. Troyer and ask him to explain some of the larger differentials as we look at 21 actuals versus 23 proposed.
I think that's a good way to look at it. If you go back a year, we were still concerned about the COVID and its effect on the economy, and we're still being hesitant about our revenue projections, and so we were very purposeful to hold them down a year ago, and so we're feeling better about it, and we think that a better comparison is our 21 actuals, because we've done better than what we expected this year. And so right off the bat, our property taxes are going up. That doesn't show up as immediate as some of your other revenues. Property taxes have a delay, and they're moderated over time. You will see an increase in the business license and franchise fees. You'll see an increase in the EMS revenue, and so that's been through first reading just to be in line with the federal rates, and so we think that's an appropriate increase, and it also doesn't put the burden of the ambulance trips on the property taxpayers. It puts the burden of the ambulance trips on the people who require those services, and it helps to maximize what we can capture from insurance as well. And so permits help to do the short-term rental permits. You'll see that both in the operating general fund revenue and another piece of that into the capital revenue for both the operating requirements to enforce the new short-term rental ordinance, as well as the capital investment to keep up with the number of properties. And beyond that, it's an increase from the state aid tax. We're able to, we as a town have always taken less than what would be allowed under the state aid tax rules, and we're still under what we're allowed, but we are taking a higher percentage or more to help support our operations. And that is because the collections have been so well. It doesn't take away from any of the other purposes for the state aid tax, and so I hope that captures that.
Thank you. And one other point. We see here grants, actual 151,926 in fiscal year 21 versus last year's budget. This year, while this is a proposed budget, I anticipate within a couple of weeks that we'll have close to $5 million of grant applications on the street. I would say a big thank you to the staff team that mobilized around that. They've taken a look at the strategic plan, the capital improvement program, and really focused on a grant application process internally here. We've reached out to some folks to learn from, including state agencies. I know staff's been up to SCPRT amongst other agencies, and I will give a ton of credit and gratitude to Sean Collin, who's leading that charge, but I know that Marcy is helping you and several others, but thank you, Sean, for that.
Mark,
yes,
do
sir.
you want questions as you're going along, or you want to hold them?
Please.
When you're speaking of grants, do we have a specific employee who is assigned responsibility for writing grants and researching grants?
Yes, sir.
Excellent,
Marcy Benson.
excellent. Thank you.
Mark, at the last meeting, we talked very lately about getting our good story out to the capital markets. Let people know we're in business for good business.
Yes.
Would that fall under grants also, telling our story?
I think it truly falls under communications, social media communications, as well as some responsibility from me. And so as we're communicating our budget, if you take a look at our social media, LinkedIn as an example, I know those capital markets are paying attention to different entities and organizations. One's direct, right? We recruit or we communicate and we find, within our own network, we outreach. But then there's also the mass communication plan, which is part of what I think social media, the power of social media through there. We have been communicating our budget to date, and upon delivery of a second and final reading budget to the community, we will have a pretty strong communications plan. So, sir, part of our plan is that outreach to the right equity, to the right, to the right investor, so to speak. Does that help that question? Yes.
John, I think it's important that the public understand what a very significant source of revenue to the town is, and that's property taxes. I think that's pretty obvious. And the 21 million that shows in the first line doesn't represent all the property taxes that we collect. The balance of them are really in the transfers in figure toward the bottom of that schedule. But there are three areas of property tax that you have been looking at prospectively as you prepare this budget for 23 and as you anticipate budgets in 24 and 25 prospectively. Would you comment on total property tax in that budget of 119 million and what you anticipate the impact to be of TIF reassessment and the disaster 5 mills?
Great. Thank you for that question. And that's something that I should have started with when we talk about revenues, is that this proposed budget, right off the top line, is expiration of the 5 mills. And so in the current year budget, there's 5 mills that's dedicated toward the natural disaster fund, and that is to pay off the debt that was issued immediately post-Matthew to replenish the reserves that were used for Matthew and prepare
And 1
us
mill is
for
worth what a
about
year?
$940,000.
So 5 mills is pretty close to 5 million.
Right, just under $5 million. And so we're collecting that, we're putting it in the natural disaster fund. It's there for the town in case there's a declared emergency. And so that 5 mills has been there for 5 years. It has served its purpose. And so the taxpayers can be thankful that that is expiring just like it was planned. Also in property taxes, and thank you for your question, we also have 2 other areas that are direct, and that's the general fund, which we talk about mostly. And there is property taxes that are dedicated to the debt service fund. And so that helps us to pay our general obligation bonds. And then beyond that, you see the TIF, and what you see on the schedule is just the first 2, the general obligation, or the general fund property taxes, and the debt service property taxes. And the TIF, which are property taxes, end up showing up in our capital plan. And so that ends up being transfers in. It's just a bit over $5 million.
So in that 119, property taxes are how much?
About $26 million. So it's 21 for general and debt, plus another 5 for TIF.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So we can see these graphs, and they're on the presentation. They're online. And so as we take a look at expenditures, we see the 26%, 11% change in budget, but 26% of total budget for personnel benefits, and about the same percentage-wise for operating. As we look down the 23 budget, what I have done this year with John is we really work to understand our expenditure burn monthly and annually. We take a look back at the 21 actual versus 22 original, and as we prepare 23. So if there aren't any questions, really the explanation of the change in personnel benefits and operating as that increases, right? As the revenues increased here, as the revenues have increased in these lines, we're arguably spending our dollars differently this year overall, with new staff member requests, additional capital projects, and more focused investment, I would call it, into our programs. Those programs, beach operations, code enforcement, maintenance of our open space, our public realm, as well as expenditures in our capital projects. And so we dive into this a little deeper as we go. But overall, we mentioned it's priority-based, the millage decreased, it's balanced with what I believe is responsible revenue projections, especially as we looked at 21 actual. And you see some higher percentage numbers year over year, 23 versus 22. But when you really go back to 21, I think we're back on track with our modest revenue projections. We're focused on resiliency planning. We talk about stormwater. We talk about the SWOT analysis of our stormwater management systems and the effects of the stormwater intrusion. We talk about and fund facilities, roads, parks, open space, stormwater, corrective and routine maintenance, as well as a very robust CIP program. And that we continue to invest in the long-range planning, right? As we talk about the district plan at Mid-Island, what's next? Or there's probably 3 or 4 other districts we could learn from and learn about over the next year through some growth framework planning and some master planning a little more specific to our island. We reduced various line item budget expenditures through some really careful analysis, and a lot of credit to John and his team, Erica, to take our budget and really put it into a software program where we can look at it year over year to refine. And I know, and I mentioned several department heads greatly reduced. Chief Tadlock, Sean being 2 of them, since they're in the room, have reduced some line item budgets so that it can do more other things and keep the dollars where they are prioritized. So thank you to them and the team. We've talked about enhancing our revenues with a short-term rental permit fee, separate than the budget, but I think it's important overall. A second and final reading anticipated to extend our real estate transfer fee, EMS rate increase, and improved revenue collections, which we talked about. Quickly also mentioned state aid tax funding to increase support of our general fund and cap projects. So proposed new positions, Director of Public Safety, 4 additional code officers. We will have a 7-day per week program. 2 additional code officers effective July, 2 in January. A question was asked, what if we need more? Well, if we need more, the Director of Public Safety will make that assessment as we onboard, as we think through the program, and I will come and share that information with you and share those needs if they're actually there. I'd rather scale up than scale back. Yes, sir.
Enforcement is one of the areas of great concern in my mind. We have a lot of excellent ordinances, but we are not as strong as we should be in enforcement. I need clarification. I've spoken to Josh about this, but I need clarification on the distinction between the authority of a code enforcement officer versus a sheriff's deputy. Of course, we don't have a police department, so that wouldn't be included in there, but I need to have that clarification so I understand what these code enforcement officers can do so that I can report that to citizens who inquire about that.
Yes.
It's a really important issue. I'm glad to see an increase of 4 new positions. I'm really glad to see a Director of Public Safety. That makes a lot of sense. It's something that's sorely needed. So I look forward to some more information on that.
Okay. Yes, sir.
One other comment, just going back to revenue enhancements, I think it's always good to emphasize the fact that that's bottom line neutral.
Explain what that means.
Sure. In other words, the revenue generated for the short-term rental program through fees is plowed right back into the management of that program.
Right. It's cost coverage of our
We're not making
program.
any money on it.
Right.
Thank you for the clarification.
We have plugged in, speaking of short-term rentals, as part of the expenditures of the revenues, a short-term rental and business license customer service manager, a CIP program administrator. That position will assist with scheduling budgets, funds, payables, contracts, and those elements that let us build our projects more efficiently, more focused. An open space program coordinator, so somebody that helps coordinate and partner with the partnerships of festivals, events, our heritage, the environment, all the things that are ongoing in our community. A facilities technician, fire rescue support personnel, and I mentioned that's for our GIS systems in fire rescue, as well as emergency management, inclusive of addressing and some special programs. And a stormwater project manager that will help with advancing some stormwater maintenance projects as well as capital projects more quickly.
Mark, I think it's important to comment about those positions being built into the 23 budget and where you place them.
Sure. Yes, sir. So as they're built into the 23 budget, some come on board in July and some come on board in January. Some of it's affordability and some of it's just scaling staff, right? Making sure that my attention can be provided along with Josh's or department heads as we bring new programs, new people on board. Director of Public Safety will be placed as a department head level, right? And so that person will report to me directly. I will have some help. I don't, by no means am I going to have every person at every level reporting to me. Josh currently oversees the code enforcement program as well as a town staff attorney and a bunch of other things. We'll figure out, but I do believe the Director of Public Safety should report directly to the town manager. The code officers will report up through that line. Short-term rental and business license customer service manager will report into April Akins, who works for John Troyer in the finance department, so a division of finance. CIP program administrator will report to Jen Ray in capital projects, and that is in the community development department, reporting line up through Sean. The open space program coordinator will report directly to the facilities division head in the community development department. There's 5 divisions, facility being one of them, right? CIP, development services, those different programs. Facilities being one of them, that person will report in the same way that Mark Robson is reporting as the beach operations oversight. That person will report to Aaron Black in facilities in that same regard. A facilities tech will report up through the lines of facilities. Fire rescue support, I believe, will report either to Tom Dunn. I don't want to put words in Chief's mouth, but I think there's about 5 or 6 people in the fire rescue department that'll be pulling at this new position. So I'll let Chief figure that out. But they will report directly into the fire rescue department. And the stormwater project manager will report in the line function to and through Jeff Netzinger, who heads up stormwater, into and through Jeff Buckaloo as the town engineer, and they all work for Sean as a direct line. So, interns, the budget also includes interns, seasonal staff, beach parking, as well as ambassadors, and some seasonal facility techs. Those techs will be eyes and ears, as well as emptying trash cans and cleaning up as we need to, and as we're busy in the season. And then funding for a town class and comp assessment and some calibration of salary. We talked about millage decrease from 28 to 23.1. A 5 mil decrease lowers your monthly bill by $100 on a 500,000% owner-occupied single-family home. We see the mill value as it fluctuates, but it's moving in a good direction over time. I've gone over, and I'm not going to stop too long on some of these. A property tax bill. We see that proposed consolidated budget, state accommodations tax projections, and we talked a little bit about this at the first reading, where the DMO by state law receives 30% of your state A-tax. That leaves a residual amount for grants at 2.9, up from last year, not as up as 21. However, we've also transferred state A-tax into general fund for operations as our operations are affected by the tourism, as well as into our CIP, our CAP projects, and mostly those dollars are pledged directly for pathways and those types of projects. A little bit of a breakdown how we're using state aid tax in our general fund and CAP projects. I mentioned, just so it's clear, and local ATAX as well into our general fund. And then we got into general fund, which is an operating account, and it's really made up of property taxes, business license, local ATAX, permit fees. And we've addressed a lot of this in the overall, and so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, except, again, to pause and say, one, thank you for having a good process in place for the affiliated agencies, our partners in that regard, as we transfer funds through Finance and Administration Committee. Thank you, Tom, for your leadership there. Josh, thank you for all your hard work and John, to put this process in place. But $2.291 million as a recommendation from Finance and Administration into our budget as it affects general fund. We can see the affiliated agencies making the request, and we can see their request and budget expenditure over time. The general fund is just more, I won't go through every highlight here, but I appreciate the ability to fund leadership development programs and staff training and certifications. Our 40th birthday celebration is this coming fiscal. There's some dollars and funds in there for managing and maintaining our public spaces better. I do drive the island and see dead plants and areas that need some love, and we will provide it with the funds in this budget, not just from the corridor, but from our parks and open spaces, inclusive of Town Hall here. I think that it's time to make some improvements. We talked about a growth framework plan, code enforcement program. This funds cultural affairs, the Lantern Parade, Crescendo production, a free symphony, and other events. And the one area to pause on as well is the translation services. It's a small number per month, but a great improvement in our service. So it's ADA as well as different languages, right? We're not just talking about Spanish translation, but we're also talking about American Sign Language, visual translation. So a surprise to me that Angie was working on this with the team behind the scenes. It was a goal about a year ago. How can we translate a certain meeting that some folks were coming to, and we're scrambling to find some Spanish translation and asking to, almost dialed a friend. I said it was kind of like that TV show, I'd like to call a friend. But this year in the budget, the program improved with a small amount of dollars, less than $1,000 a month, more or less, to get into a translation. So good job to everybody. A commitment to recruiting and retaining employees with benefit package enhancements up to 3% performance-based back on the schedule of July. Last year was December. A 401k retirement plan increase, a company match from 11 to 12. MedFlex reimbursement from $800 to $1,000, so $200 per employee. A new option to buy back vacation up to 25 hours per year. We talked at first reading about a policy. I'm very, I would say, I feel the same way. I know that taking time is important. There are, this would probably be used more by people with a few hundred hours of vacation in their bank to allow for some movement there. And we'll write the policy to make sure that employees are taking their time, but that they also have ample time in their bank and not just cash it all in. If you would vote on second and final to approve this. We're, of course, covering the unfunded mandates from the state for health insurance, fire rescue, retirement premiums. Beaufort County Sheriff's Office Island Stipend from $350 to $550, and then funding for this class and comp, including fire rescue. I put including fire rescue, not because the other departments don't matter as much, but Chief Tadlock has presented to me some real good information where he's made a proposal and a request to keep his department funded very competitively in the region. And so there's some calibration of some areas in the fire rescue. I wanted to be clear on that. I won't get into all of this. We really covered a lot of it in the overall revenue schedule, but I can answer some questions if you'd like. And then, kind of more of the same as what we've already said. I just wanted to dive a little deeper at first and second reading, as well as have it in the presentation on how the general fund revenue is being used. So new short-term rentals, state aid tax, business license revenue increase. In the increase, if we take a look back, the increase year over year is 13%, but as you look back to actual 21, that percentage is much, much less. We had very conservative revenues last year. H-tax revs used for new fire trucks, EMS we talked about, and no use of fund balance for the proposed general fund budget. Revenues over time. General reserve, so we've made a proposal to change the current percentage. Oh, I messed up. There we go. The current percentage as a basement of 35% up to 40%, to 40% as the low, and up to 55% as a high. The general fund reserve policy. It's not just to save funds, John. That fund policy is for, I want them to hear you say it.
Sure.
Emergency.
Absolutely, and it's, if there's an emergency, that helps to make sure that the town is able to keep operating. If there's a interruption in our revenues, interruption due to the economy, and interruption due to a disaster or a hurricane.
It would be helpful for you to report again what the rating agencies said about our policies in this regard.
Yeah, they were very favorable for it, yes. And we've spoken with one recently, Moody's, and then we'll have conversations with both Standard & Poor's and Fitch coming up.
So, I have a question. So the general fund reserve, we've only spent those monies for disaster recovery or emergency situations. We don't spend it for anything else?
For the encumbered reserve. So if we encumber, right, so the general fund emergency reserve is what John's referring to. We've only spent those funds for that. You have some unencumbered general fund, right? So prior year funds, those don't necessarily need to fall into that category.
And ballpark, how much money in
That's
the
okay.
bank right now?
I think the number is around $3 million. So what we're saying here in total, general fund, at $25 million, that's how we finished out the last year, is that this change in policy would just make where we are right in the middle of the policy.
Okay, maybe I'm not being clear with my question. We're proposing that we increase what we're currently putting away as reserve, as a concept, correct? Okay. And this is for disaster recovery, all right? But we built up a reserve over years, correct? That's not $3 million. Yeah, what's that number?
$25 million.
Thank you. So where I'm going is there a policy in place that states that we only have to use the reserves for disaster recovery and emergency? Or if we get into a situation where maybe we have a land acquisition deal, not enough money in real estate transfer fees, could we dip into this fund, is what I'm asking.
The town has been operating above policy, and so town council would be able to operate, and so you've got a lower limit and an upper limit, and then town council could operate, there would be room above the lower limit.
I think the question is, or one answer is yes, we could, but the other question is, should we do it? And I think once you make a commitment to the rating agencies and to start deviating from that, you're asking for a lot of trouble.
I think you ought to put it on the session we're going to have in July to discuss that. Alice's point is well taken. I remember in the earlier years, we balanced our budget by borrowing money from ourselves. You know, I'm here 6-8 years now, but in the early years, we balanced money. And that was wrong. That's when the hurricane happens.
Okay, I'll put it on there.
Yeah, where I'm going is, I'm in support of the increase because I understand inflation, things are costing more. But at the same time, we're in a different environment in terms of what we may need to go after. Real estate transfer fees may not be enough, may have some stipulations that box us in. So, how do we bite off a bit so that we make sure we're in a good position to make solid decisions later on? And I agree with John, this is a discussion for later on. I just wanted to bring it up while we were on this.
What we'll provide and what we'll put together is an assessment of our fund balances, right? We can find a lot of it in our audit and all those pages, but we'll put an assessment together of all the funds and all the fund balances, because this is simply one of them. And to your point, it's a great question. What other funds could we potentially acquire property or acquire some of our priorities, use to acquire for our priorities? Perhaps this, I would suggest no. Once we set this in place, we keep this for emergency, but I think it would help if we're very clear on what the other funds are: H-Tax, A-Tax, Stormwater, unencumbered general fund, those types of things.
Our policy is expanding the range and moving it up.
Yes.
As long as we maintain a fund balance within that range, I think Alex brings up a good point. We're not necessarily locked into 52%. We can drop it down to 41% and still be within that range. And although we may not use the fund balance, we may not fund it additionally as we have in the past and use those funds for some other purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's easier and more advantageous to us to borrow the money than use our own. I mean, from a credit point of view, a good loan out there and a good reserve is better than using our reserve money.
Well, the increase in the disaster reserves is clearly needed if we look at the rate of inflation since Matthew. We know that it's going to cost us a whole lot more for the next storm, and there will be a next storm. John has already done a lot of research in what our expenses were coming out of Matthew to try to come up with some more justification and reasons for increasing these reserves. So this is a prudent move for us to make at this time.
Okay. Thank you. As we get into stormwater, we know that it's funds for stormwater-related expenditures. The majority of the stormwater utility fund is stormwater utility fees. A proposed budget of $5.8 million. Close to $3 million is used for either capital projects or routine general maintenance of our stormwater system. You can see that the various funds or the fund is used for various expenditures. Some transfer out to general fund for operating, 14% out to seek capital projects, 12% inventory modeling, as well as the corrective and maintenance from the public and private systems that we talked about.
Mark, I was suggesting in our July retreat, we take a deep dive into the stormwater, so both us and the public know that we're doing things both in the PUDs and outside the PUDs, how the money is spent and what the priorities are, so we know what's going on.
Yes, sir. Simply like to explain, our rate at 150 is still leading in the region, and I think we're doing a lot of good with the dollars that we produce.
Thank you.
I have pledged to be more clear on how we're using our stormwater fund, and I mentioned that I believe strongly that as we build capital projects, they should live in the capital improvement program, so that Jen Ray and Sean can oversee the project delivery by schedule, by how we spend our dollars through that process. But then also, we know that this system this program is so much bigger than a capital project. A water quality LMO compliance and the MS4 permitting, that's arguably a federal mandate through the state, unfunded. So we provide a special stormwater permit on all development activity. And there are additional requirements above and beyond. And we use our stormwater utility fee to fund that. inventory and modeling, routine maintenance, pump station maintenance, 4 of them, corrective maintenance in our public and private systems. No new vehicles this year. We will do the SWOT analysis of our island resiliency called out in the strategic plan. We'll talk about what that scope of work is, also what it isn't, as we get into that July discussion. More transparency in project development as well as on our maintenance program. So public systems, private systems, 59 projects, and again, we'll dive a little deeper. Funds transferred into capital projects at $830,000. I will ask you that if you see the projects up here that you were hoping to see, great. If you see some projects that you know that you've received phone calls on 5, 6, 7 times, or even 1 time, please let me know. I don't know where all of those risks are. I don't know, our staff's doing a fabulous job. From an assessment, I think we'll learn a lot though through this SWOT analysis, right? It's not just a high-level policy discussion I want to have. I want to understand the policy necessary for our future, as well as capital projects and maintenance projects through our island stormwater SWOT analysis, our island resiliency.
Does the Gumtree project help with it, Mr. Barnwell's problem?
I don't know. I could find out. I think that's a question. Sean will take that note and find out and report back to you, sir. I talked a little bit about climate adaptation and sea level rise, the resiliency SWOT analysis, but really there's $250,000 of stormwater utility fees plugged into the budget for this program. Capital projects, threshold of greater than 5,000 except for roads, buildings, and computer technology equipment, and that threshold is 50. You know that there's a process in place. I explained this a little slower at first reading, but we know that the projects in place for your consideration have been reviewed and discussed by you, by staff, heard from some community members, and it's also been through Parks and Rec and the CIP committee for input, as well as prioritized by Planning Commission. $45,671,933 capital improvement program. Use of funds is clear percentage-wise. Funding sources overall, or CIP sources of funds, come from impact fees, bond proceeds, as well as transfers in, beach pres fee, hospitality, A-tax, general fund. It's important to note that we aren't using any general fund into CIP, just as a little note. So these are the priorities of Planning Commission, from roads to parks, facilities, fleet, land acquisition. Again, this isn't a presentation. It lives on our website. Our projects are throughout the island. We funded various elements, and we can't see it. I apologize, but you can dive into this. Right? This has been online. We've been provided this information. You might have a hard copy in your binder. But for the most part, it takes fiscal year 22 projects. It carries the unspent forward into additional funds if needed for fiscal year 23 for a fiscal year 23 total. It's clear on what the project scope is in 23. I want us to be clear. Not everything's under construction this year as much as we want it to be. We have to take our time to build the right project. I think taking our time to build the right project is on a large project, it's close to 3 years. By the time you mobilize, obtain your input, really think through it, and not just keep building the same thing over and over again, so that our projects are prioritized by you, that they are addressing a community impact, and that they're innovative and solving problems. I think that's a 2-year cycle by the time we survey and permit and find the dollars. This next fiscal year, a lot of what we're after is in the final, well, in the design and permitting phase, with a bigger year construction in fiscal year '24. We have no ability to spend the entire amount this fiscal year out of the CIP. However, those dollars are parked in those accounts for our work. Yes, sir.
The adaptive signals
Yes.
is within this. Two
Yes, sir.
questions on that. I know that the listing did not include Wells and Squire Pope Road, but we talked about that. That's going to be included.
It will.
And as far as a projected completion date, do we have any idea when those will be up and operative?
On the adaptive signals, no, I don't have that yet. I think that once I get through, and we're working to establish that right now. One, we're looking at a grant, and so that funds about 80% of the work. I think our schedule here would be dependent on the grant. I don't think we can spend, we've asked the question, we can't spend the money, and if we get the grant, reimburse ourselves. So we have to make those decisions. Do we want to find the 80% match via an EPA grant? That grant will be dependent on it. Sean, any offhand, do you know when that deadline of the grant is, when we would know about that award?
I know we submit it later this month, probably 60 days
Yeah.
around for decision.
What I'd ask is, let me work on that schedule. I'll get it back to you. You know, it's a high priority. I hear it. It's a high priority of mine. We will build it as fast as we can. If we wait on the grant, that's going to predicate that schedule. As soon as we know those dollars, we're ready to go, though.
Yeah, I think you keep us informed on that, because I think that's pivotal with what's going on with the not just the state portion of the 278 project, but also what we're doing with our own William Hilton corridor exercise. And I think it's a discussion for council. I hear what you're saying about not lending ourselves the money without the grant being available, but this is very important to our future and where we're going. So I wouldn't want to have the grant denied. You know, that's worst case scenario, and
Right.
we do nothing, right?
Right.
So, okay.
Yes, sir. If the grant is denied, we'll work together to allocate funds in this. I've talked to Beaufort County, we've talked to our state partners. We have, you know, we've got a plan A and we have a plan B. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
That was my question. Thank you.
On the adaptive signals, I've heard, and I assume other members of council have heard from some local experts, and quote, saying that there are different forms of adaptive signals. Do we have some professional advice that we have received about what is the best form of signal for us to use here?
We do. We have some, you know, one, we have an incredible traffic transportation engineer on staff with Darren. We also have access to some pretty sophisticated consulting firms that have worked on these systems and advised on these systems throughout the U.S. As we bid the project, as we'll write the specs so that we address all of those issues. That's where this project works or doesn't work, as you scope the bid on the project. And so I know, you know, as late as last night, God bless him, Jeff Bucklew, I forwarded him an email and he wrote back somewhere like 8:30 at night saying, yes, I'm on it. We will scope this according to. So, again, nobody laughed at my initial picture's worth 1,000 words photo, but it is in the budget. It will be scoped properly. I appreciate everybody's urgency as well as concern on it. Out of the $45 million, it's about a $3 million project. It's for every signal on the island. I think we overlooked not putting those two intersections, and we will modify that for second and final reading. It will be in the second and final reading as it's represented in the CIP. And we'll get to work. We've got to chase a grant first. I think it's important that we find dollars external if we can.
Mark, I would like us on the mid-year review too, because with the supply chain being far behind, unless you start moving on this even before you get the grant, we might be years before we get the material that we need. So we should discuss this deeper in July. Okay.
Yes, sir. So with no further questions on CIP, and I apologize, it looked so much bigger when I was standing up there from over here. Debt service, we talked a lot about it between this year and last. If we take a look at the principal payments versus the interest payments, we know that we're over 2 fiscal years spending down more than $30 million of principal on our debt. So as a budget, a proposed budget of $19,374,081, it covers simply principal and interest. The revenues are clearly identified from transfers in, as well as John mentioned earlier, the property taxes, the TIF dollars, $5.4 million. And final payments are things that we're tracking as well. And we'll see that there's a good list of final payments in 23, 24, and 25 for both, or for the GO, as well as the special revenue bonds and one stormwater bond in 26. So we're starting to pay off a significant portion of our debt. No new bonds planned for this year. This is the 5th year in a row where our net debt declined. The budget includes GO and special revenue bonds, pretty much last year's budget, and that it proposes to keep the debt service at 5.9 mils, and no new bonds are proposed in this budget. For a consolidated budget proposal to you for your consideration of $119,501,114. We're here at our workshop, June 7th. We have anticipated for second and final reading, as well as public hearing on the budget. And I believe we've scheduled a public hearing for 3 p.m. as soon as we get out of the gate, so that it's clear. Any questions?
A few things. Yeah. Thank you again, Mr. Orlando and your team, for job well done with this year's budget, particularly that it follows our strategic plan very, very closely. I don't have anything as far as this budget is concerned, but because you're so good at taking notes, and I don't want to forget this stuff when we move into strategic planning workshop, I'm going to take the opportunity to mention them now. We've had discussions with Palmetto Breeze about expanding their program here on Hilton Head. I think long-term, we can definitely look at that as more than just a trolley service for our visitors, moving them from one beach to another. I think we need to think a little deeper about our transit system here on Hilton Head. As I mentioned before, parking is a preem on Hilton Head, and the less cars we have moving from place to place, I think the better off we'll be. And also the ability to have some type of shelter at stops gives us just a little bit more permanency in our program. I've been paying attention to where the stops are, and that low pole doesn't do a whole lot as far as we are a community that is providing transit to and fro. The town council, the executive budget, there's a 16% increase there. I'm just wanting to know, does that include our attorney and legal fees that's in there also?
It does, yes.
Okay. We take time every year to evaluate Mr. Orlando, okay? I think that's very important that we do that. And I'm sure he has evaluation process for his staff. Currently, we do not have an evaluation process for our town council, town attorney, and I think that's important that we have that. not just for us as we sit here today, but for future members of council as they come into existence.
Let me mess that for a second, okay? Last Friday, I think it was, Mark and myself had a couple-hour meeting with Curtis again. At that time, I reminded Curtis that he works for the council, not for the town. A couple of the things needed correcting, which I won't go over now, but we agreed to once a month having an executive session just for the council, no staff, no Mark, and Curtis. Where once a month, we would hear and talk to Curtis and let him fill us in on the things, and us go back at him and say, this is what we think you're doing wrong or you're not doing. So we'll start doing that once a month, and then we'll have to start a review process right after that, yes.
Thank you, sir. And the last thing, we talked about it a bit at first reading, but the idea of a housing stipend for our employees, I think, again, is very important. I use the same example that I used then. You know, folks choose to live elsewhere other than Hilton Head, that's one thing, but if we're asking them to participate in all the wonderful things that we're doing, and not just punch the clock from 9 to 5, stay a little later. I know you don't come in on Saturdays, but I'm gonna use that. The investment and the ownership of the community is important. And all of that hard work here and making Hilton Head a better place than going back to Bluffton or Beaufort to participate in church and extracurricular activities. I think we can do better. So again, Mr. Orlando, thank you. You and your team have done a great job here, and I'm ready to move forward with this budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Brown. Thank you.
I'm fine. I've got clarity on some things. I'm still waiting for some others and additional questions that I can ask separately that aren't really relevant to the numbers.
Mr. Lennox?
I think we discussed the areas that we focused most often on, and the town has shown its ability, town staff and leadership, in managing expenses very effectively. When you take a look at $119 million in expenses and recognize that 45 million of that is in the capital improvement projects, I think it's evidence that the town has effectively been able to allocate funding for the appropriate level of facilities and services with that amount. And of that 45 million, half of that is carry forward from previous years. So we're not committing $45 million in current funds to capital projects. We are recognizing that it takes, as you said, Mark, 3 years to build a project. And before we can commit to a project, we have to have funding in place. And that's what that 45 million shows. We have it in place and we are able to start it. However, we're probably not able to complete it for at least 2 or 3 years. I think the revenue forecast that funds this budget, as Mark showed on one of the slides, is conservative. We're showing a $2 million increase in gross revenues, and that $2 million really comes from a new source of revenue of $7 million, which is the lease proceeds for the fire rescue equipment, and the loss of $5 million as the 5 mills sunsets. So the net of that is the $2 million. Everything else is very consistent with previous years. And one last comment I will say as it pertains to revenue, if you take a look at the 2022 budget that's on that screen, it is John Troyer's estimate that budget is going to be pretty close to what June 30th, 2022 actual is. So for comparison purposes, we can pretty much compare the proposed 23 budget to the 22 original budget and call that actual. There are some significant increases in '22 that we're recognizing in beach preservation fees, local and state accommodations taxes, and real estate transfer fees. So I think we're not extending that trend. We are simply level with that. I feel good about it, Mark.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Len?
Thank you. Mark, you came in just about a year ago and had to act in budget hearings based upon limited information as much as you should gather. Well, you've learned a great deal over the past year, very clearly to me and to each of us. This budget presentation is extraordinary in that it goes into detail, but it's easily explained. And I compliment you and the whole staff for doing an outstanding job on this. John, your input has been invaluable to my service on the Finance and Administrative Committee, and I think all of us have a better handle on what's going on. Certainly, I know that I did 3 years ago versus today. I have mentioned 2 hot-button issues to me. One is, do we have adequate disaster reserves? This is we know there's going to be another storm, we just don't know when. And we also know that the expenses for construction and construction-related services, including gathering of debris and so forth, are going up very much and increasing with inflation. And so I want us to be very conservative in that funding. The other hot button issue to me is what I see is a great weakness in this town government, and that is our enforcement capability. Mark, you have come forward with some strong recommendations about increasing the number of enforcement officers that we have, and I think that's vital. I think the concept of a director of public safety will give all of us a lot more comfort and will make it clear how we can continue to improve that. But we need to make sure that we have enforcement personnel here who have the power, the training, the authority, the equipment necessary to enforce our ordinances for the benefit of the residents of this island. So I congratulate you on an outstanding presentation here, and I look forward to moving this budget forward to second reading and putting it into place starting July the 1st. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mayor. I hope, I think that the community can feel good about the budget. We haven't heard from the community yet. Should we be asking those who are here?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I look forward to their comments. Couple of things that I'd like to request, Mayor, in our July meeting. We're emphasizing and focused on the Mid-Island track, and that's a big project. It suggests redevelopment. And in order for us to implement those plans, I think the town is going to have resources that expedite that redevelopment. In other words, the town may have to be purchasing existing development properties, reconfiguring them from an LMO standpoint, a zoning standpoint, and then proposing either public-private partnerships, the sale of that property. But the bottom line is I am anticipating that in order to implement that project and other projects, Palmetto Bay Road, wherever, that we're going to have a redevelopment fund. And that is going to have to be something that the town wrestles with in order to implement those projects in a reasonable time period. I noticed that in the budget, use of funds, land acquisition is 0, and I don't think that's consistent with where we need to be going. Secondly, that same pie chart says housing is 1%. I understand where those monies are coming from this year, but I think for us to implement a meaningful and beneficial housing program on the island, we're going to have to establish a line item, call it our own island trust fund or something else, but I think that we're going to have to do that, and it was recommended by the consultant 3 or 4 years ago that we do that. So I'd like those things to be discussed in July. But I want to give the budget and you credit for your commitment to the public realm open space. First, you said you're including a program manager for festivals and the coordination of events and so on. I feel strongly that one of the reasons Hilton Head can be even a better place for our residents and for visitors is that we are more intentional on how we manage the activities in our open space public realm. The emphasis of programming should be equal to the emphasis on facilities. And then secondly, you have a line item for care and maintenance of open space and a commitment to improve both the aesthetics and the quality of the natural realm that is in that open space. And I appreciate that, and I would applaud you and the budget for including that kind of emphasis. Thank you, Mayor.
Bill?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I won't repeat what's been said. I agree with all the comments that have been advanced so far. Some little add-ons here. The most tangible thing to the public, I believe, is the capital budget and translating that into something that someone can see and touch. And I think that creates in the mind of the community that we're listening to them and we're trying to upgrade a place they call home. So what I would encourage, and I know we're doing this, I believe already, but every project has a milestone, every project has a completion date, every project has a story to tell, and let's challenge our communications people to get that word out on projects as they evolve over time. I think that really engenders a lot of sense that community government is listening and we're accomplishing. In terms of the trust fund that David was referring to, we have an unusual opportunity, I think, that I would like the Finance Committee through Tom and ourselves during the strategic planning to say, look at the aggressive debt service schedule we have. Look at how retirement of bond vehicles is rather dramatic. And can we use that decrease to some extent in debt service as an opportunity maybe to increase a bucket we'll call a trust fund for whatever. Certainly workforce housing, and I would submit not alone, but in terms of public-private partnerships, could be one of the items that would justify being dropped to that bucket. I think that would be very important. We need an ongoing, repeating source of revenue to do this. Otherwise, it's ad hoc. It becomes up for voting. It comes up for debate. And this would be a more systemic way, I think, to handle it. And I think in closing, this, in my mind, this budget, which matches action with plan, is the best budget I've seen here. So thank you.
Thank you, sir.
That work, Mark, if it's to be done through the F&A committee, should be done prior to the retreat, not during the retreat. Okay? I'd like to hear now for the important people in the room, the audience, the citizens. Who would like to speak first? Risa.
Mayor, I'm here today representing COIN, the Coalition of Island Neighbors. I'd first like to appreciate the effort made from town staff to do a deep dive into your operations spending and to ensure that, you know, you've looked at all the dollars that are being invested. And to Mr. Orlando, thank you for bringing transparency and what I call principle-centered process here, where our community goals truly drive our investments. I'd like to echo Mr. Stanford's comments on code enforcement. I think that you can legislate as much as you want, but without enforcement, it's meaningless. So I appreciate that growth effort. And I'm greatly relieved to learn that the adaptive traffic signal management project will include all of the intersections on the island. I was prepared to lobby for that today. I do have a couple of concerns. One is, while I totally support increasing the island resident stipend for the sheriff's office employees, I'm concerned about doing that without equitable benefits for town employees. And I'm hoping that that benefit will be added to the list of items that are being considered in the compensation package review, and perhaps added in a way where employees have the right to choose from a list of options where they're allocated certain dollars, and then they choose how they want to spend those dollars. I think that's a method that I was granted as an employee, and it felt like the organization was allowing me the benefit of choice for what best met my lifestyle. And the second thing is our Sustainable Community Housing Initiative, as Mr. Ames and Mr. Harkins noted, may require more funding than we currently have in this budget. I'm hoping that the town, with the development partner or partners that we select, will be creative in looking for other financing sources for our first North Point proof of concept and future projects. So thank you again for permitting public comment.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? No? Okay, thank you all very, very much. Bringing it back. Mark, you want to have a couple closing words?
Yes, thank you. First and foremost, a big thank you, and I know it's probably just a time to say some thank yous, definitely to John and Erica in the back room, who doesn't like being the center of attention, but let's address that for a second. Thank you, Erica, for all of your hard work and taking what John and I are talking about and knowing what we mean in those rooms, so thank you. A great big thank you to all the department heads. You know, this is a budget I proposed. It's a budget I believe in, but it's a budget that was built with the department heads' involvement and ownership, right? So I really appreciate that they are listening too. They are behind you taking notes as well as I'm taking notes. And, you know, at the end of the day, I'm here to present a budget to you that you support. It feels good, and I think very appropriate that you support it, but you're also very clear with me on what you want in addition to. So I appreciate your feedback, your ability to communicate that to me. I'm proud to be the manager sitting in front of you. I'm grateful, and I can't wait for second and final reading to be over so that we can get to work. So.
If there's nothing else, we'll close this meeting. Have a motion to adjourn the meeting? Have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So moved.
Second. All in favor? Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, David.
We're still not getting a hint.